So this command was for our good always. And this is the command, the Sabbath command, that we tend not to look at. We've talked about that many, many times. For me, and I would imagine for many of you, growing up, going to Bible class, when we talk about the Ten Commandments, the statement was always made that 9 of the 10 commandments are repeated in the New Testament, but the one that is not is the Sabbath command, because we are not to observe the Sabbath day. That was what I grew up hearing. That is certainly true. That is certainly true. Nobody's going to argue with that. But there are principles in the Sabbath command that are just that. They are principles. And they are still as valid in 2021 as they were when God gave them all those years ago. I want you to read with me Exodus 20, beginning in verse 8. Exodus 20, verse 8, beginning. Listen to what it says. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all of your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath of the Lord your God, or to the Lord your God. In it you shall do no work, you, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male servant, nor your female servant, nor your cattle, nor your stranger who is within your gates. Because in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day, and he hallowed it. All right, let's stop right there. God knew the principles here, of course, as we've talked many times before. God knew that we needed balance in our life. The 3 principles that are here in this, as we've talked before, are work and rest and worship. That doesn't change. That God intended for his creation to work, he intended for his creation to rest, and he intended for his creation to worship. That doesn't change. In many ways, this particular command in the 10 is God's maintenance manual for his human creation. And so in this, he makes provision for each one of those needs that we have. You stop and think about that. If we fail to respect the principles of that command, what happens? Well, it does have some ramifications physically, obviously, morally, emotionally, domestically. It just has ramifications in so many different ways if we don't honor what he says in this command. I want you to notice how emphatic God was with this. You know, this is the command that God, the Holy Spirit, takes more time in dealing with this command than any of the others. Well, why is that? Well, this is important to God, obviously. And so he gives some explanation. I want you to notice how emphatic he is about this. He in his explanation, he says, you can work for 6 days. I want you to remember the Sabbath, keep it holy, work 6 days, do all your work. The seventh day, rest. That's a day committed to God. And then he goes on and says, in it, you shall do no work. And then he goes on, you, your son, your daughter, your male servant, female servant, the visitor in your land, your animals, none can do any work. And then he gives the reason for that. He says God provided an example in creation. And so this is the example that he wants us to follow. You know, I think when you first read those words, they almost sound arbitrary and they almost just sound restrictive. I mean, if you just give it a cursory reading, you think, well, why is God so concerned about this? But the more carefully you consider it, the more clearly you'll see God's wisdom. So let's talk about those 3 things and then make a couple of applications in the minutes that we have tonight. And so God began by saying, 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. 6 days you shall labor and do all of your work. And by the way, it wasn't just God's human creation that he said, I want you to, you can work for 6 and rest 1. There was something else to the Jews that God said, 6 work, 1 rest. Anybody remember what it was? Anybody? The crops. That's right. You can produce a crop for 6 years and then you give it a rest. You give it a rest for a year. You can have orchards that produce fruit for 6 years, and then we just want you to prune and give the land a rest. And so here, the beginning of it, though, has to do with human beings, as human creation and work. It's always been God's will that man be involved in some kind of a meaningful task. Where did work first begin? Where did God first say something about work? Pardon me? In the Garden of Eden. In the Garden of Eden. Was work part of the curse in the Garden of Eden? No, it was not. So many people erroneously believe that God gave man work as a part of the curse after the fall, and that is absolutely not the case, is it? And so in Genesis 2, the Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and to keep it. And so before the fall, before the curse, God said, I want you to work because this is good for you. Everybody needs a reason to get up in the morning. Everybody needs a reason to put your feet on the ground in the morning. God made us so that we need a meaningful task. And so the curse after the fall affected the circumstances, but not the necessity, right? The circumstances were changed because now they had to contend with what? In the garden. Yeah, weeds and thorns, thistles, things that would make the work more difficult. And so it affected the circumstances, but not the necessity of the act. But God created man to work and to achieve and to accomplish. Jesus is our example of that, right? Nobody was more active. Nobody was more productive than he was. And so his initial job was what? What did he do growing up? He was a carpenter. He was a carpenter. He was a carpenter till he was, 30 years old. And then at 30, he left that work and he began his ministry. And when you read the life of Jesus, his days were very busy. He was a very hard worker. His disciples were workers. They were, many of them from Galilee were fishermen, but they all had an occupation because that's the way God designed that to be. I think there are several reasons why God wants us to be involved in meaningful labor. I think God wants everybody to be involved in doing something productive. And there are several reasons for that. Somebody just tell me, why would God want us to work? It's not a part of the curse. It's for our good. Why is that? Tell me one reason. There's a sense of accomplishment in that. Right. What else? What's the most obvious? You need to work to do what? To provide. You need to work to provide. And so it enables us, as Eric said, to have a sense of accomplishment, to achieve some things. And that's pretty important. Generally those who work hard in life are those who are going to arrive on time and concentrate their energies and give attention to detail and refuse to cut corners. And, you achieve. It gives you a sense of accomplishment in that. But then it enables us to provide for our family. And so that's critically important. God intends for us to be able to do that. You remember 1 Timothy 5:8. If anyone doesn't provide for his own, he has denied the faith. He's worse than an unbeliever. He's worse than an unbeliever. And so we need to work to be able to provide. It was never God's will. It was never God's will that we be parasites on society. Now, granted, sometimes there are individuals who are physically incapable of working. We understand that, right? We understand that sometimes disabilities occur that make that physically or perhaps mentally impossible. God made provision for that, particularly for Christians, for the church to help and to care for that. But the general principle is verses like Ephesians 4:28, where he said, look, the one who stole, let him steal no more. Let him labor, working with his hands, what is good. And so that's the general principle. God expects us to work. Or 2 Thessalonians 3:10, if you will not work, you should not eat. If you will not work, you should not eat. And so it enables us to provide for our family. Third, it provides a sense of well-being. There is something to be said for going home at the end of the day and being tired because you worked hard. There's something to be said for that when you feel like you've accomplished something. You may be tired, but you have a sense of satisfaction in that. I don't understand going to work and not working. That does not compute with me. It just doesn't. You can do that. I think there are a lot of professions where you could go and you could just kind of shuffle papers and kill time and make the day go by. Or individuals who don't make any preparation or no effort to stay current in what they're doing or to stay fresh, or even students who don't give their best effort. How do you feel good about that? How do you feel good about that? And so it gives us a sense of well-being. It occupies idle time. What's the cliche about that? About idle hands? What's that cliche? Devil's workshop. And we've said this before. Things come to be a cliche because they have elements of truth in them. They get repeated because there's an element of truth in that. And so idle hands become the devil's workshop. Well, this is a way to occupy idle time. Hard work keeps away a lot of temptation, right? Who's the quintessential example in the Old Testament of somebody who had too much time on his hands and got himself into a lot of difficulty? Solomon, but before him, David. And so David doesn't go to war. It's that kind of cryptic statement in the verse. David did not go with him to the battle. Well, why not? And so he stays home. And he has leisure time. And he becomes a voyeur. And he commits adultery. And it's devastating to his life and to his career. But, leisure is, in fact, a wonderful diversion. Everybody needs that. We're going to talk about that in a minute. But, as that cliche suggests, too much time can allow the devil a good place in our life. It's interesting, isn't it, that there are some people in this world who've never, because of family circumstance, they never really had to work. Never had to work, never learned to work. And oftentimes it does not work out well for them and the kind of person, the kind of people that they become. And then there's one more here that I think is really, really important. And that is that work enhances our influence as Christians. That good work, hard work, diligent work, productive work, giving your best, it provides a good influence as a Christian. If you work on the job and your fellow workers know that you are lazy, that you're just doing enough to get by, that you don't give your best effort, that you're just killing time and punching a time clock, there's not much good influence in that at all. You may, in that circumstance, say something perceptive about your faith and Christianity, but it's probably not going to resonate very well. But the opposite is also true. And I tell you what, I think that's true. I think God intends for us to be productive for as long as we're breathing. Don't you? We've got a lot of retired people in our church. And I tell you, we've got a lot of retired people in our church who retired from their job, but they didn't retire from life. We've got a lot of retired people in this church who their life now, their job now, their work now, in many ways, is serving other people. And almost every day seem to be. There are people in this church that it seems to me who are retired who every day they're finding some way to serve somebody in some way. Just absolutely admirable. Absolutely admirable. I think God intends for us all to be productive until the day that we die. I've said this, I've told you this story before about my dad. He was about 3 weeks from dying, and he was asking me to take his library and bring it to my office. But when I first went to do, I refused at first. And he said, no. He said, when I die, he said, you're going to have a lot of things to take care of. I want you to do this. But as I was going back to his library to start boxing things, he said, now wait. He said, I want you to leave me. And he ticked off a dozen books. And I said, well, what are those, Dad? And he said, well, son, I've got to keep studying. And that was just his mindset, that as long as he had a mind, at least he could do that. He couldn't do anything physically anymore. But at least with his mind, he could keep studying. He could keep learning. There's something really valuable to say about that. God made us to work. Everybody needs a reason to get up in the morning to have something productive to do in some way. Now, the second part of that is rest. And God emphasized that as well. And we're going to say a little bit more about this because he gives a lot of instruction here about that. So he says, 6 days you shall labor, and look at that, do all your work. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath it's more literally to. It's a Sabbath to the Lord your God. And so it's a Sabbath to or for the Lord your God. Now, that do no work business on the Sabbath day for Jews, God took very, very, very seriously. And so there are these little passages that pop up in the Old Testament. And when you leaf through the Old Testament, what you will find is that on the Sabbath day, they could not gather wood, they could not light a fire, they couldn't plant a field, they couldn't harvest a crop, they couldn't tread a winepress, they couldn't load or transport grain, they could not bring fish to market. In fact, on the Sabbath day, the city gates were to be closed and business was not to be conducted. What was the penalty for violating that for a Jew under the old law? Anybody know? What was the penalty? It's pretty severe. You shall keep the Sabbath because it is holy for you. Everyone who profanes it shall be put to death. Whoever does any work on it, that soul shall be cut off from among his people. Well, that's a pretty harsh penalty. There's a story in the Old Testament about a gentleman on the Sabbath day who was collecting some wood, picking up some wood, some firewood, evidently. And the elders came together. They found him guilty, and he was stoned to death. Seems like a pretty harsh penalty, doesn't it? What does the word Sabbath mean? What does the word Sabbath mean? When I was growing up, I thought Sabbath meant Saturday. It does not mean Saturday. What does it mean? Rest. It means rest. It just means rest. And so it is rest. It's a Hebrew term meaning rest or cessation. The Sabbath was a gift from God to his human creation. The Sabbath was not created for the benefit of God, but for the benefit of man. Sabbath rest seems almost out of place, doesn't it, in American culture? I was reading an author who said there are two words that describe American culture: hurry and worry. We're in a hurry, and we worry about being in a hurry. And there's a lot of truth in that. A lot of people kind of live their life that way. But the point of the Sabbath commandment is that God did not create either our bodies or our minds for uninterrupted exertion and constant tension. And so the Sabbath was God saying, look, I didn't create you to never wind down. I didn't create you to live that kind of a life. Now, in American culture, that sometimes is hard for us. Now, there are other cultures in the world where it's not so difficult at all. I've said many, many times about my brethren in Italy that I love so much, but just Italians in general, that they may die of many things, but an ulcer will never be one of them. They know how to relax. It seems like when you're over there, every other day is a holiday, and and not only do they do all that, but in the middle of the day in Italy, that whole siesta culture is still in place. So, almost all businesses are shut down from 1 to 3 in the afternoon. Well, why? What are you doing? Well, we're resting. Well, an American, our heads would explode about that. You just can't do that. But most of us, we grew up learning a work ethic from our parents. And my parents were like many of yours. I mean, the work ethic that they passed on was that you work hard and you push yourself and you step outside your comfort zone and you do your best to be your best in whatever it is that you're going to do. And the upshot of that is that sometimes we go to extremes. We go to extremes with that. I've not been good with that. Some of you know that. I've not been good with that. I've made some bad mistakes with that. I would just freely confess. Year after year after year after year after year, if I was home working 7 days a week, and it took and has taken somewhat of a toll. And it's just because it's not honoring what God said is good for you. That was my wrong in that. Sometimes people have had to intervene a little bit about that. I remember several years ago sitting in an elders meeting, and the elders, this was maybe 15 years ago, and the elders said, "We want you to go somewhere." And I said, "Okay, where do you want me to go?" And they said, "We don't care. We just want you to go and don't do anything." And sometimes other people have to help us a little bit, help us gain perspective with things. And sometimes even when we go to rest, because of the way we live our life, we don't rest very well. Anybody ever go on vacation and it takes you 2 or 3 days to wind down and get on vacation? Yeah, probably most of us have been there. But I tell you, once you get there, it's nice, isn't it? Once you reach that place. Several years ago, I read something. Let me read this to you. I tucked this away in a file years ago. One comedian said, the most frustrating thing about driving is you spend your whole life stopping at red lights. But there's a very poignant irony. When you die, they let your funeral procession run the red lights on the way to the cemetery. I guess when you're dead, it's important to make good time. I'm dead, but I'm early. I thought, is that not perfect? Even coming to a red light, we're in a hurry. I did this tonight coming to the building. I was coming up, I was driving down Fowler, and I came to a red light, and there were cars. In the 3 lanes, there were cars, and I had to decide which car I thought would take off fastest. And that's the lane I got in, right? So I got behind the V8 Ford F-150, and we beat everybody. But so often it seems we live like that. In the middle of all that, Jesus said, look, remember this. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. In other words, the Sabbath was God's gift to his human creation. And so God wasn't saying, look, I'm going to force you to rest, even though it's not good for you, even though it's just kind of an arbitrary, punitive law, I'm going to make you rest. And that's not it. God said, I'm going to give you a gift. And I'm going to tell you that you need to make sure that you take some time. And the example for all that is what God did. So, in the days of creation, on the 7th day, God rested. What does that mean? You take a nap? What does it mean? He just stopped. He changed his pace, or he stopped, right? Look at Exodus 31 here, verses 16 and 17. Therefore, the children of Israel shall keep the Sabbath to observe the Sabbath throughout their generations as a perpetual covenant. So he gave this to the Jews to be a perpetual covenant for them. And it was based, in the 10 Commandments, on the fact that God rested at creation. Think about Jesus again. Nobody accomplished more than he did. And yet he went to a mountain to pray for prayer and rest. 1,000 other things he could have been doing. But he took some time. So here's the upshot of this as we get to it. The other element in this is worship. So it's work and rest and then worship, right? So take a look at the verses again. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. So for the Hebrews, it was different than every other day. It was sacred, separate. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is the Sabbath of or to the Lord your God. And so this day was unlike all others. Now let me ask you a question here. When I was growing up, it was common to hear that Sunday is the Christian Sabbath. I heard that a lot growing up. That Sunday is the Christian Sabbath. Anybody recognize the name Eric Liddell? Anybody recognize Eric Liddell? Who is that? Somebody tell me. Chariots of Fire. That's exactly right. Eric Liddell was the centerpiece of the story Chariots of Fire. Anybody remember in Chariots of Fire what he was famous for? Not running on Sunday. Right. So in the 1924 Paris Olympics, Eric Liddell, his best event was the 100-meter dash. But when he received the schedule, the preliminaries that would lead to the finals were going to be held on Sunday. And he refused to run. He refused to run. He said, I'm not going to run on Sunday. He said, to me, Sunday is a sacred, holy day to the Lord. And he said, I won't run on Sunday. What do you think about that? What do you think about that? Was he too narrow? Was he too rigid? Was he thinking about Sunday in a too narrow kind of way? What do you think about that? Pardon me? He was principled. Right. See, whatever you think about that or whatever I think about that, it doesn't matter. It was what Eric Liddell thought about that. Right? And so his conscience said that he could not do that on Sunday. That was his conscience about that. And what did Paul say about violating your conscience? In Romans 4, he said, don't do it. Don't do that. And so he would not violate his conscience about that matter. And he didn't run. That's the basis of the movie Chariots of Fire. Now, I'll tell you the rest of the story in a couple of minutes. But that was his view about that. Was Sunday, or is Sunday, the Christian Sabbath? That's the way he saw it, by the way. He believed that Sunday was the equivalent of the Sabbath, and you couldn't do any work on the Sabbath, as was the command for the Jews. Now, that's the way he saw that. I don't think that's accurate. So is Sunday the Christian Sabbath? No, because again, look at this verse. Therefore, the children of Israel shall keep the Sabbath, to observe the Sabbath throughout their generations as a perpetual covenant. It was a perpetual covenant for the children of Israel. It's not for us. It was not designed for us. And so, I mean, we know these passages, don't we? We know from Colossians 2 that Paul said, look, having wiped out the handwriting of requirements that was against us, which was contrary to us, he's taken it out of the way, he nailed it to the cross, and so let no one judge you in food or drink or regarding a festival or a new moon or, look, a Sabbath. These things were shadows of the things that were to come, but the substance is Christ. And so it's not the Christian Sabbath. That's not an accurate way to look at that. Sunday is not equivalent to the Sabbath. Christians, of course, you well know, just as we do, they didn't worship on Saturday. They worshiped on Sunday to celebrate the day that Christ rose from the dead. And by at least the end of the first century, Sunday was evidently commonly referred to among Christians as the Lord's Day, because John says, I was in the Spirit on the Lord's Day. And so he's using terminology that clearly the Christians who would read this were familiar with. So Sunday came to be known as the Lord's Day. That's an accurate term to use. So if you want to think about it this way. I love this quote. In the Old Testament, the Jews worshiped on Saturday to remember a finished creation. In the New Testament, Christians worship on Sunday to celebrate a finished redemption. That's a great way of looking at that. It's an accurate way of looking at that. In the Old Testament, Jews worshiped on Saturday because that was the example that God gave regarding creation. But in the New Testament, we worship on the day that Jesus came forth from the grave, the day that the church began in Jerusalem, and the day that was acknowledged by John as simply being the Lord's Day. It's interesting, in the New Testament, there were those, Pharisees in particular, who tried to bind on Jesus not the Sabbath law, but the Pharisaic traditions about the Sabbath. How did Jesus deal with that? How did he deal with that? Did he bow to their wishes? Absolutely not. He did not. I think that's important. You know, Jesus refused to be bound by the Pharisaic traditions regarding Sabbath observance. The Sabbath law was pretty clear, wasn't it? I mean, did anybody have trouble understanding what we read in Exodus 20, 8, 9, and 10? It's pretty straightforward. But the Pharisees, man, they added layer on top of that. And Jesus got in trouble for that. You remember he and the disciples are going through the grain field one day, and they're taking the grain of wheat, and they're rubbing it in their hands and popping those kernels in their mouth. And the Pharisees they just go crazy about that, because you're threshing. You're doing work. You're threshing. Or you remember the man with the withered hand, and everybody's watching to see if Jesus will heal him. And Jesus says, let me ask you something. You got an ox on the Sabbath that falls in the ditch. You're going to leave him there? You're going to pull him out? Isn't a man worth more than an animal? And he healed him. And he wouldn't abide by those traditions. The Jewish rabbis took very wholesome injunctions that God gave that are easily understood, and they took it to ridiculous extremes. For example, in the Mishnah, which is it was the first collection of oral Jewish traditions that was written down. There's a lengthy tractate that has 40 different acts that are forbidden on the Sabbath. These were the traditions that came up. You can't separate two threads. You can't write more than one letter of the alphabet. You can't tie a knot. The Pharisees took it into the stratosphere. They had 1,521 separate rules regarding the Sabbath day. Imagine that. 1,521 rules about the Sabbath day. They built all kinds of rules to keep people from getting even close to breaking a Sabbath law. And so if the rule was that a tailor could not sew together a garment on the Sabbath day, one of the rules was that he was not allowed to take his needles home with him lest he be tempted to do that. A scribe was not allowed to take his pen home on the Sabbath day lest he be tempted to write some letters. Some of you will appreciate this. The Pharisees said that a woman is not allowed to look in a mirror on the Sabbath day because she might see a gray hair and be tempted to pull it, which would be equivalent to reaping. Today probably wouldn't be a problem, at least from what I heard. A lot of women's hair is kind of chemically dependent and the gray's not there, but evidently in that day that was a deal. The point of that is that they took something that God gave as a blessing to man, and they just made it a horrible, horrible burden. The reason I mention that is that sometimes we do that with Sunday. When I was growing up, it was very common to hear, you can't mow your yard on Sunday. You can't play a sport on Sunday. I was never allowed to play a sport on Sunday growing up. You can't work. You basically can't have any fun on Sunday. Now, we reject that, or at least most of us would reject that. But I will tell you that it's easy to go the other extreme with that as well. And could it be that sometimes we've gone to the other extreme and just made Sunday pretty much like every other day, except that hour or two that we carve out to go to church? We can do that as well. Things have changed a lot about Sunday just in my lifetime. For example, when I was in the younger part of my teenage years, I lived in a state that had blue laws. Anybody know what blue laws were? Nobody has blue laws now. Anybody know tell me what a blue law was. What was it, Ollie? It's not just no alcohol.
Or anything until church is over.
Yes.
In New England,
That was in New England. This was in Missouri. When I was a boy in Missouri, the blue laws, you could not open a business on Sunday. When I was 12, 13 years old, you could not open a business on Sunday in the state of Missouri. When I was a boy, professional baseball teams did not play night games on Sunday. They scheduled their games so that they would be finished at least by 6 o'clock, because after 6 o'clock, what did people do on Sunday night? They went to church. They went to church. Everybody took Sunday off, right? So, on the one hand, you have that. But on the other hand, if we're not careful, ladies and gentlemen, the Lord's Day can really just can become the Lord's hour and a half, 2 hours. But the rest of it, it's pretty well mine. Think about that a little bit. On the one hand, we don't want to become Pharisaic, and we don't want to make laws where God didn't make laws. But on the other hand, shouldn't we acknowledge that Sunday is a special day? You've probably seen this quote. Our Jewish fathers called it the Holy Sabbath. Our grandfathers called it the Lord's Day. Our fathers called it Sunday. We call it the weekend. There's a mindset in that. There's a mindset in that, I think. So, while we don't have Sabbath restrictions in the New Covenant, the fact remains that it's the Lord's Day. And let me just say, regardless of whatever else we do, and, I'm like you. I do a lot of different things on the Lord's Day. I really do. But regardless of whatever we do, the Lord's Day first and foremost and fundamentally is to make sure that we worship God. And we just can't lose sight of that. We need to make sure that we worship where God's word is taught. where our spirit can be strengthened because of that, where we can participate enthusiastically, and where we can go home better because we were there. All right, we got to finish up. We've got about 2 or 3 minutes left here. This is for our good always. Deuteronomy 6:24. These things I command you, they are for your good always. The Sabbath was meant, I think, to be 3 things for us. Number 1, a safeguard for our families, a safeguard for our families. I didn't put this verse on the screen. I want to read to you from Exodus 16 and verse 29. This is the business where God's giving them manna, right? And he says, I'm going to give you manna, but on Friday, I want you to take a double portion. You can't go get any on the Sabbath. Listen to what he said. The Lord has given you the Sabbath. Therefore, he gives you on the 6th day bread for 2 days. Let every man remain in his place. Let no man go out of his place on the 7th day. Well, that's what the Hebrews did. On the 7th day, they stayed home. And so the Sabbath in many ways was a safeguard for families. What would they do? What those families do? I mean, they didn't have TV. They didn't have any DVRs. They didn't have internet or cell phone or tablets or computers. They didn't have computer games. So what did they have to do with each other? They had to talk to each other. They had to build some traditions with each other. They had to spend time with each other. Again, something that oftentimes we seem to be missing. And it's a safeguard for our subordinates. Exodus 20 and verse 10. The 7th day is a Sabbath of the Lord your God. You shall do no work, nor your son or daughter, your male servant, female servant, your cattle. These are instruments of work. And so he's saying the things that you control, your children, your servants, your animals, you control those. And this is a protection for your subordinates. And then, of course, for ourselves. Again, work and rest and worship. All right. And then secondly, it's a reminder. It's a reminder of who God is and what God has done and why we're here and what gives life meaning. It's a reminder. And ladies and gentlemen, even Jesus acknowledged that, right? I think one of the most amazing verses in the New Testament is Luke 4 and 16. He came to Nazareth where he had been brought up, and as was his custom, he went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day. I mean, Jesus acknowledged that this is for our good. It wasn't just obeying the law. It was a reminder. It was a reminder of what he was about as a Hebrew man. And then it was a sign. Exodus 31 and verse 13. Speak to the children of Israel, saying, surely my Sabbath you shall keep. It's a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that you may know that I am the Lord your God who sanctifies you. It was a sign. It was a sign to them, but also a sign to the nations around them. And then one final thing. Let me give you 3 things to take home. I think when you think about the Sabbath principle, work, rest, and worship, there are 3 questions that come to mind. Number 1, am I refreshed? Is there some activity that I'm engaging in on a weekly basis that refreshes me physically and mentally? Because God says that's for my good. Secondly, am I reflective? The Sabbath was designed to turn our attention from the world of creation to the creator of the world. And so, am I reflecting on that? And then third, am I refocused? People of character meet regularly for worship with the people of God, to refocus, to check their compass, to get back in line with values and with absolute realities. I told you I'd finish the story of Eric Little. He didn't run on Sunday, so he couldn't compete in the 100-meter dash, which was his best race. But on Tuesday, he ran in the 400-meter. That was not his best race. Before he ran, somebody gave him, this is depicted in the movie, somebody put a piece of paper in his hand, and it was a quote from 1 Samuel 2 and verse 10. Those who honor me, him I will honor. And with that, he went out and won a gold medal. But he honored his conscience, a man of principle. Something to be said for that. Thank you all for your help tonight very, very much. Great to be with you.